Well, hey there, idiots. Welcome back to Observe. In today's video, we're going to be analyzing the nonverbal communication, again, of the parents of Summer Wells. I have done a video on this subject, this case, already once before. If you have not seen that video, I do suggest you go and check that out before continuing this one. This will just be following up with that one. That one gives all the backstory of the case itself. So go and check that out before watching this one if you want that context. More on that in just a second. Let's go ahead and roll the intro first. Okay, so we'll be looking at the most recent footage of the Summer Wells parents, seeing what we can from that, and then we'll also be taking a look at that investigator's nonverbal communication as well to see if there's any context that we can gather around that from his nonverbal communication. So I think that's enough of the backstory for this video. Let's go ahead and just dive directly into it.
Borden Park is anything but quiet this time of year. But 3 years ago, it was filled almost weekly with people praying for Summer Wells.
I see all these families, with their kids and how much they enjoy them and stuff, and we were stripped away from all our kids. All our kids have been kidnapped from us by DCS, and who knows, we're not sure about Summer, but we know about where our boys are at.
While the prayer vigils are...
Okay, so... find that fascinating. Immediately, we're hearing from Don, Summer's dad, as he's starting to try to set himself up against the legal system, which kind of gives us somewhat of a feeling as to how this case might have been progressing over the past couple of years here, as he's starting to say that his kids were kidnapped from him by these governmental agencies, that's what they do. Now, in regards to that, the living conditions were found as unsuitable for kids that they had been providing. So there were reasons that the children were taken from the Wells parents to begin with, even just environmentally. Along with that, there were reports of them misusing firearms in regards to their children, and it's still ongoing. So even as I said in the last video of this video is still just an entertainment internet video. So this content, this video should not be used on any level for a form of evidence for this case, as it is still actively ongoing, and there are many more facets that are going into it than just an internet video here. That being said, we're going to go ahead and continue on through this.
Are now few and far between. Don and Candus Wells haven't stopped praying that their daughter Summer will be found.
We have hope, always. But there's not much hope in this world. We have to trust God that there's hope in eternal life in heaven.
All right, so he's saying that they have hope, and he starts having a little bit of difficulty holding eye contact there. Now, that difficulty of holding eye contact can be indicative of a few things. It could be an indicator of him having a level of psychological difficulty because he's lying. So there's that possibility, but there's not nearly enough around that to be able to say, oh, this is a possible indicator of deceit. We're also having to consider the emotional state that he would be in while talking about these things, which would be lending towards his breaking of eye contact regularly. Along with that, we're seeing a small little micro no shake in there as he's saying there's not much hope in the world. He has difficulty around that verbally as well, and then he falls into bringing in religion again, which he had done in the prior videos. Many people will use religion as a shield of sorts to be able to keep eyes off of them. After all, if a person is a religious person and they're morally upstanding, then how could they do something wrong? So there is that possibility of it being used as a manipulation point. It also does, on some level, just shrug responsibility of a specific scenario to an external source that can't be questioned or tried. However, Don has shown that he is a religious person, has gone to church at least a few times, and so him bringing that back in here is not something that's shocking. Again, if you saw the first video, there would be more context to that would add to that. Let's continue.
We know that she was taken off our property, and we know she was taken away in a vehicle, or they would have found her in the area if she was somewhere in the area. But who's responsible for her We don't know.
I asked Don and Candus when
Gonna go ahead and pause there. It is interesting that he's saying that they know a certain number of things, and I'm not sure if that's coming directly from the law enforcement or the search teams that are going around. But he's saying, we know that she disappeared, we know that she was taken, we know that she was in a car, and these are all difficult things to really prove. My question also is how can he speak so certainly on that in an area that might not be as certain? Perhaps the searches have been fully exhaustive, and there is no chance of there being like a body or something like that on the premises or in the surrounding area. So there is that possibility. But one of my original theories around this is that I don't necessarily believe that Summer Wells's parents did anything intentionally to Summer. I'm not certain that they like sold her. Many people are assuming that it was centered around selling for perhaps drugs. I'm not certain on that, and I haven't seen any evidence that really directs towards that. And none of the footage that I've been able to track down has been centered around that enough for me to be able to get a read on. So I'm not positive on that, but what does stick out as quite likely to me, just due to the parenting patterns displayed by the Wells parents, is perhaps a level of neglect that Summer went out into the wilderness or into the countryside there, and perhaps something bad happened, and she was either just severely injured or fatally injured, or she was killed in some way due to their neglect and not watching their child. And because of the circumstances around, they felt like they couldn't bring that forward or report that death because so many people would be looking at them, so they covered it up themselves. That sticks out to me as one of the more likely reasonings for this disappearance outside of that selling or perhaps somebody kidnapping her for some reason. There are some locational difficulties that go into that don't really indicate that it could be a kidnapping, but there is still that possibility, as even Don himself has brought up here. Regardless, let's continue watching.
Candus, when was the last time they heard from investigators?
We haven't lately at all. It's been a while, over a year, I think. I haven't talked to any law enforcement at all. I tried to talk to the FBI agent about it, but that didn't go anywhere.
Don said
Okay, so during that time, he's doing a consistent no shake. They're going from macros to micro shakes. So the smaller the movement, the less likely it is to be controlled. So with that no shake in there, we haven't seen or heard from them at all. That is synchronized with the verbal statements that he's making there. However, even in his verbal patterning, he's saying, I don't know. And we're starting to see that also slip out with the lopsided shrugs that continually have been popping in there as he's talking about this statement. So with that, I wouldn't actually believe or buy that he has not been approached or talked to or contacted by law enforcement on any level for the time that he's been saying here, even indicated by his own nonverbal communication and the verbal phrasing that he used in that sentence in and of itself. So perhaps there has been more contact, and that also then just builds a little bit more towards this. The Wells family is very anti whoever else is really out there trying to help, but also demanding everybody try to help side of things. It's a complex case, to be sure. Anyways, let's continue.
Don says he feels that he and his wife Candus were targeted by the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office.
They intimidated us, they belittled us, and done everything they could amidst all the chaos, and then the CPS was there doing the same thing.
When asked about how he thinks about Summer's disappearance 3 years later, Don spoke about a Department of Children's Services investigation.
They said somebody had called and said that we was giving our kids loaded guns to play with, and so they closed the case June 14th, which is something CPS does not do. They don't just close cases. So,
all right, I'm going to go ahead and pause here because we're already dealing with a fair bit of information. Not too much non-verbally was happening throughout this period, but verbally speaking, what he has already done again is paint himself against the people that he is trying to ask for help. He's saying that law enforcement was attacking them, that they were belittling them, a whole slew of things, and that Child Protective Services is also villainized during this period as well. And again, the living conditions that they had provided for the children were not acceptable living conditions for children to be raised in. Ergo, the children being removed from that environment. Now, with this accusation of giving firearms to their children. He doesn't address it outside of this little blip here. And from everything else that I've seen, it would not seem unlikely for him to have done that. Either they didn't give it directly to the children and it was just neglectful. The children found the firearms and were using them and the parents didn't care, or perhaps it was intentionally done. Neither of those two options seem very far-fetched from the background and the history from what I was able to see from the Wells. Now, throughout this little interview here, which is, again, 3 years later, Candus never says anything in this interview. I reached out to the news organization to see if there was extended footage that I could take a look at, but I was not able to hear back from them, at least by the making of this video here. So perhaps there will be more centered around this specific clip, this interview. Perhaps there will be more interviews to be able to take a look at, but in this one, Candus doesn't respond at all or mention anything at all. And many people feel like that is a fairly telling thing, that she's staying completely silent during this, but there are also a slew of other interviews and clips of Candus talking to people. So I wouldn't necessarily say that her silence in this is an extremely telling factor. It is interesting to be sure, and it does seem to indicate perhaps a level of detachment from the situation, which this would also not be the first time that we have seen this level of detachment from this case from both parents. Again, it's very fascinating. And then this last verbal thing that he says here, where CPS does not close cases, I went ahead and I dug into that and looked around a little bit. That's not true. CPS closes cases regularly. There are some forms and some systems that they go through to be able to get to the point of closing a case, but it is still closed. And then along with that, CPS isn't necessarily the ones who are in charge of closing said cases. It's oftentimes down to a judge or a legal statement saying that the case is closed. So there's some misinformation that he's presenting here as well, with CPS doesn't ever close cases. They always keep them open. Not true. So again, we're seeing Dawn trying to hypervillainize the people that are really largely supposed to be there for the children. And that's fascinating to me, in that this is all centered around trying to make sure that the children are okay. It's just interesting details. Let's continue.
So it's really odd and mystifying why they closed the case June 14th, and then 24 hours later, Summer's gone.
Summer's mother, Candus, sat in for part of our interview, but got up after a few questions.
She was going to try, but her emotions are just too much.
Which I don't necessarily buy that either, with Candus sitting in and her emotions being too much. In the little clip that we got to see of Dawn and Summer sitting together, the nonverbal indicators from Summer were not showing any level of emotional distress. There was a slight eye roll in there. There were no indicators of emotional seepage. It didn't look like she was about to cry. There weren't any hot areas of activity across her face, perhaps in the glabella area or in the corners of her mouth, where you might be able to start seeing some of these emotional tells start to creep out. It was fairly detached, and then there was the slight eye roll in there as well as the conversation was being had between the interviewer and the Wells parents. So Candus not speaking and Dawn saying, oh, it's because she was too emotional, that to me does feel less likely. It is messy, to be sure, and non-verbally speaking, we're not seeing these indicators that Dawn is claiming. Regardless, now we're going to move on to the assistant director of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the TBI, and he is speaking on the progress of the case itself. So let's watch how that is, and we'll talk about his nonverbals at the end of that.
We don't have the evidence in this case to know for sure whether or not Summer was abducted or whether or not she walked away from her home and became lost. It's really important to us to not focus all of our efforts on just one of those two.
Okay, so for this gentleman here, immediately the statement that he made flies directly into the face of what Dawn said, where Dawn's like, we know that she did this, we know that she was taken, we know that she was in a car. Immediately the law enforcement is like, we don't know any of those things. So far we understand that at least one of the two is lying about what is known or isn't known. So with Don already spreading misinformation about the case and the goings on about it, it does make me start to question the validity of what he's saying in regards to the entirety of the case. But something that you will notice with his nonverbal communication here is that he is looking down regularly into the same place. That's letting me know that he does have some form of note cards to be able to reference regularly. So he'll be checking in there regularly. We'll be checking to see throughout the rest of his nonverbals to see if there's any pitch changes or any nonverbal seepages around that might be indicating something other than what he is stating very clearly verbally. Let's see.
We think that the only way we'll be successful in finding Summer is to continue to walk down both of those investigative paths to ensure that we don't become focused on one area alone and miss something that's crucially important. I would say
that's fascinating to me. Now he's saying we need to make sure that we focus on both of those options, that Summer perhaps wandered around and something happened to her in the surrounding area, or that she was abducted. We need to look at both of those options because we don't want to hyper-focus on one and miss any indicators of the other. And that goes directly against what Dawn is saying. Dawn is saying, no, we know that she was taken and that she was taken far away in a car. So let's focus our energy on that, which then, by contrast, to hear the assistant director of the TBI say, no, we're focusing on both, to me, that counts as a red flag against Dawn. And for him to want to divert attention from the local surrounding area there seems suspicious to me. And that does still fit in with the theory that I have, the possible theory that I have of a fatality happening due to neglect. And so if that were the case, then the parents would not want further searching to be done in the local area. They would want it to go further away. So it is a fascinating pattern that we've seen across the two different people here. Let's continue.
this case has not gone cold. A cold case is typically framed up as a case where there are no tips or leads that are coming in, and there are no investigative efforts that are happening because there is no place to travel with the investigation. I would say in this case, thanks to the public, we've continued to have tips and leads that have come in that agents have been able to follow up on continuously. And the agents have worked tirelessly when tips and leads weren't coming in to try to find ways to investigate when typically people would lay down their effort. It has been a great partnership between the community and law enforcement to not let this case sit and go sterile. We continue to...
All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause there. So even in this portion where he's talking about the relationship between law enforcement and the public, the community, we are seeing him break eye contact a number of times. Now, I was watching to see where exactly is he breaking eye contact to. Is it to this note card area that he seems to reference regularly? And while that is a number of times it seems as though he's looking in that area, it is also varying around in that area as well. So we're left wondering, what is this breaking of eye contact? The breaking of eye contact and looking down into the side can be seen as shame or guilt in that vein of emotions. However, this is not speaking of something that is shameful or guilt implicative of him, then the shame doesn't make as much sense. Another reason for breaking of eye contact is to recollect, as extra psychological processing kicks in. But he does have a lot more difficulty looking up either at the interviewer or at the camera during this time while talking about the relationship between the law enforcement and the public. Perhaps there's some animosity between that. Perhaps it's not as helpful. Perhaps there have been useless tips or invalid tips of people calling in things that weren't as important or useful. There is also the possibility that that's simply where he looks to consider, to think about his words as he's speaking. There are a number of possibilities in it. None of the ones that would be more implicative fit the scenario as well as some of these more general answers do. But there's still a few minutes left. Let's continue.
Continue to focus on ground search efforts. We continue to focus on interviews of those who may have information about vehicles that have traveled through the area or technology that could have been used that may give us an investigative lead. All stones are being turned over. There's not one thing that's being done. We've been extremely creative as we've investigated this case and continue to try to find ways to turn over rocks that we didn't even know that were there to turn over. Children are our top priority at TBI. They are the most vulnerable population that we have.
Okay, so he's saying that being very exhaustive. Again, there's nothing non-verbally to direct me away from what he's saying there. I would believe him that they are indeed doing their due diligence, trying to find this person. There's not really a reason for them to not want to find a missing young girl. Then he switches around and it has a cut there, and he says that children are the TBI's like main focus, which it can't be true. That it should be a very primary focus, especially in this case, but it can't be true. There's more crimes that go into the world than just ones against kids, and they are a crime investigation unit. So it can't be their primary focus or their main focus. And along with that, we see a little bit of a hunching up of the shoulders. That defensiveness also pushes me down that vein of perhaps it's not their primary focus, and this could just be a little bit of wordplay to be able to pander towards this specific interview that he's giving, of being like, no, it's one of our primary focuses, which that compensation does push me to consider the fact that perhaps they're not doing as overtly everything that they said or claimed that they are. Perhaps they are falling off a little bit, especially as it's been a few years and there haven't been really any solid leads for things. Perhaps that energy and the effort and the manpower put towards this case has actually decreased some, and that defensiveness comes in there due to that. There are a number of possibilities, but we've made note of that. Let's continue.
They're our most precious things in our world. TBI has always placed an emphasis on missing children. We've done that through multiple programs that are established here. We look for children when most people aren't. And this case is one that we've just not been able to overcome, and it's troubling. Many people have speculated what they think has happened in this case. The difficult part of the speculation is that if we as investigators speculate and focus our efforts in one direction, we're making a huge mistake. We have to make sure that we're being completely comprehensive as we investigate. And
I'm going to go ahead and pause there. And that's it's an important distinguishment between what Don's approach is and what the actual professional's approach is. So Don is saying, no, we focus on the one thing. Don't consider anything else. We know it's going to be they got in a car and went far away. Has to be that. Only focus on that. And we're seeing here that it's being presented by law enforcement as a different situation, that can't be done because it will blind them to certain possibilities if they pop up. So that's pushing me towards authenticity again on law enforcement's part, and a level of unreliability on the Wells parents' side of things. Fascinating dynamics. Let's continue.
And being focused in one direction is a tragedy for an investigation. So until we find evidence that points us in a direction that we know is the right direction, we'll continue to be comprehensive. We'll continue to explore every option that can be out there, and we would continue to ask for the public's help in doing so. Typically, we have a couple of agents assigned to an investigation, and that's been enough. We've had over 6,500 leads, tips and leads come in on this case. Those have all been reviewed. They've been worked. We continue to get those. And it is a monstrous task, but it's one that's not overwhelmed us. We have been strategic in the way that we've handled this investigation. We have some of our most talented agents assigned to this case, some of our most talented intelligence analysts from the Bureau assigned to this case. We have brought in subject matter experts within TBI from across the state to assist in this investigation. We have thrown everything that we know to throw at this case, and we haven't had the answers that we need to get. We know we'll get them, but we don't have them today. When I see the picture of Summer Wells, I say,
okay, so throughout all of that, he is describing all of the efforts that have been made. He's not doing anything that's straying from the baseline that we've seen within this interview or this little video clip that we're seeing of him. So during that time, not really encouraged to disbelieve anything. And then he says towards the end of that he knows that he will get these answers towards this case, and then he does a fairly telling mouth shrug in there, which is an indicator of a lack of security in what's being said. It's the same as a shrug. So to me, that is a little discouraging to see. To me, it kind of feels like there's not as much hope on his half that they will get those answers and that this might indeed shift into a cold case. Everywhere else, it seems as though they are still being quite exhaustive and expansive with their searching and their research for this case, which is good to be able to know. So let's continue. There's only a few seconds left and we'll talk about it at the end.
But we don't have them today. When I see the picture of Summer Wells, I see my daughter. And I can tell you that if my daughter was missing, I would sure hope that somebody was looking for her every day. And it brings me concern and satisfaction, really, the concern that we don't have the answers, the satisfaction of knowing that we have the best agents at TBI that are working on this case in connection with other local law enforcement and federal agencies who are doing their best. And if my daughter was missing, all of the people that are working on this case are the people who I would choose to work on a case if my daughter was missing.
So that's the end of that. Again, when he was saying that the agents are doing their best, you see another lip compression, mouth shrug in there, perhaps a little bit of uncertainty, some negative emotion around that. Perhaps there have been, again, I'm suspecting that within the investigative units themselves, that there have been a drop off in the intensity of the searching just due to time alone. So we're seeing that non-verbally slip in there. So we're seeing, as a total, across the two little clips here that we're looking at, we're seeing a very different picture from the Wells parents as opposed to the actual law enforcement doing the searching. We're hearing two different approaches to things. The interesting funneling that Dawn is calling for to not look in the local area anymore. Perhaps to play advocate for him, perhaps it's because it has been exhaustively searched and so they're pretty certain. But according even to law enforcement, it doesn't seem to be the case. They still seem to be interested and engaged in doing local searches as well as looking in a broader area. It has me asking some questions. I know that there will be some level of disconnect between a family of somebody who is missing as opposed to the law enforcement, especially as the emotional influence from within the family side of things is going to be very prevalent and very strong. That really can affect how a person's perception of a search might be going if they're not feeling like it's matching the emotional intensity that they feel that perhaps the law enforcement is lacking. So there is that possibility that's playing in there. So that's my small analysis of this. Again, it is working in tandem with the earlier video that I did that has a lot more information packed into it, a little bit more telling footage. So go and check that out. If you did like this video, please consider hitting the like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already, if you want to see more of these videos. I am going to be releasing more video content onto my memberships and Patreon. So if you would like to go and check those out, you can. Absolutely no pressure at all. But if you do, thank you. And for those of you who already are members or patrons, honestly, thank you so much. It's making a huge difference. That's my whole spiel for everything. I hope you did enjoy this video, but without further ado, that's all that I've got for today. My name is Logan and you have been oh so awesome as you always are. And I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.